My name is Sadie Ellison, and 10 years after my parents emptied my future into my brother's hands and let me walk out the door with $200, my mother stood in the middle of my pottery studio in Asheville, holding a bowl she had treasured for years, and finally understood that the maker's mark pressed into its base. A small spiral she had run her thumb over 100 times belonged to the daughter she had thrown away. She did not know it was my studio. She had driven up into the mountains for a long weekend, the kind of trip people take when their life has quietly come apart, and she had wandered into common clay because a shopkeeper downtown had told her that was where the bowl came from, the one she loved most. The one, she said, felt warm even when it was empty. She wanted another. She came looking for a stranger, a famous local potter people talked about, and she found me at the wheel with clay to my elbows, and she knew me in an instant, because a mother always knows her child, no matter what the story says. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. She looked at the bowl in her hands, and then at the spiral on my apron, the same mark, and then at my face, and I watched the whole thing arrive in her all at once. The bowl she had held through the worst year of her life had been made by the child she let go. "Sadie," she whispered, "I need to take you back to understand why that spiral undid her, and why I did not run to her, and why the answer to all of it was learned at a kiln. 10 years earlier, I was 18 years old, sitting at my parents' mahogany dining table, and I thought I was about to have the best night of my life. I had worked for it the way only an overlooked child works for things, with a desperation that looked like ambition from the outside. Straight A's. Every club, every competition. A future I had built one late night at a time because I believed, God help me, that if I was good enough, they would finally see me. And that night, I had the proof in my hands, an acceptance to a school I had dreamed about since I was small, and I laid it on the table like an offering. My parents did not celebrate. They exchanged a look, the one that in our house always came before my brother Miles got something and I got a lesson about being mature. Miles was 4 years older, and the son the whole house turned toward. He had dropped out of college to chase one business idea after another, and each one had failed, and each failure had been met with more money and more faith, while I was told to be practical. That night, my father cleared his throat and told me that Miles was close to something big, something that could change the family's fortunes, and that it needed real investment. And then my mother told me, in the gentle voice she used for hard things, that they had decided to give Miles the money they had set aside for me. All of it. 200 and some $1,000, gathered penny by penny since I was born, birthday checks and savings bonds, and a grandmother's careful gifts, handed to my brother without anyone thinking to ask the girl it belonged to. I want to be honest about the money, because for years I told this story wrong, even to myself. The money was not really the wound, and I know that now. A bright, stubborn kid can find another road to a classroom. There are scholarships and aid and a dozen ways in for someone willing to fight, and some quiet part of me knew that even at 18. What they took from me at that table was not tuition. It was the answer to a question I had been asking my whole life without saying it out loud. Am I worth betting on? And they looked me in the eye and chose my brother's failures over my certainties and gave me their answer. No. When I objected, my father used my full name and told me to go to my room until I could be rational, as though wanting my own future were a tantrum. And something in me went very quiet and very clear. I went upstairs, and I did not cry. I packed a backpack. My documents, my clothes, and the $200 I had saved from tutoring. Money I had been keeping to buy myself something to celebrate the acceptance I would now never use. I climbed down the trellis outside my window the way I had as a kid, and I walked away from the Ellison house, and I did not look back, and I did not tell them where I was going. Here is the part I have to own, because it belongs to me. Leaving was necessary, and leaving was also running, and for a long time I could not tell the two apart. I disappeared completely. I changed the shape of my life so they could never find me, and I told myself it was strength, and some of it was. But some of it was an 18-year-old still trying to win the old argument by vanishing so hard they would have to notice the hole. I spent years secretly performing for an audience that had already left the theater. That was mine to carry, and it cost me, and I did not understand it until much later at a wheel with an old woman watching my hands. The old woman was Della. I ended up in Asheville almost by accident, a bus ticket and a cheap room and no plan at all. I was down to my last $40 when I walked past a pottery studio with a handwritten sign in the window that said help wanted, mostly sweeping. Della owned it. She was 70 years old, sharp as a chipped tile, and she looked me over, this scared kid in nice clothes, and instead of asking about my past, she handed me a broom. She did not need my story. She needed the floor swept. And that turned out to be exactly the kind of grace I could survive. I swept that studio for months before Della let me touch the clay. And the first thing she taught me, the thing that became the truest thing I know, she taught me at the kiln. On the day I pulled out my first real glazed piece and burst into tears because the color was nothing like I had planned. You cannot judge a glaze going in, Della said, turning the piece over in her old hands. You never truly know a glaze until it comes out of the fire. The same dull gray powder can come out of one kiln the color of ash and out of another deep as a river at dusk. You do not judge a pot by how it looks going in, child. You judge it by what the fire brings out of it. I have thought about that every day since because I was that gray powder. My family had judged me by how I looked going in. Plain, practical, quiet, a sensible little thing not worth the investment. And they were not there for the fire, so they never saw the color the fire would bring out of me. I learned to throw. I learned it was the thing I had been reaching for my whole life without knowing its name. Work that did not care about my last name or my grades or anyone's approval. Work that only asked whether my hands were honest and my patience was real. When Della's hands got too stiff for the wheel, I ran the studio for her. When she passed, 4 years after she handed me a broom, she left it to me, because by then I was the closest thing she had to a daughter, and she was the closest thing I had to a mother, and neither of us ever had to say it out loud. I did not build an empire. I want to be clear about that, because the world is full of stories where the thrown-away daughter comes back a billionaire and buys the family company and fires everyone at the long table, and that is not this story, and I am glad it is not. What I built was smaller and, I think, harder. I turned Della's studio into common clay, a working pottery and a school, and my work started selling, first at markets, then in galleries, then to people who drove up into the mountains just to find it. I made enough to live and enough to give some away. And the giving was the point, because I knew exactly what it was to be a kid nobody wanted to bet on. So I started a free apprenticeship, and I filled my studio with teenagers the world had already written off, the ones with bad grades and hard homes and no fund set aside for their future. And I put my hands over their hands at the wheel, and I taught them the thing Della taught me. You cannot judge the glaze going in. One of them was a girl named Kayla, 16, furious, brilliant, thrown out of 2 schools, the kind of kid a dining table full of adults would have looked at and sighed over. She reminded me so much of myself that it ached. And the day Kayla pulled her first real bowl out of the kiln, a glaze she was sure she had ruined, and it came out the deep river blue that only the fire can promise, she cried the same way I had cried, and I told her the same words. And I understood that this was what I had actually been building for 10 years. Not proof. A place. The place I had needed and never had. Which brings us back to my mother, standing in that place, holding a bowl with my mark on it, saying my name like a question she was afraid to hear the answer to. Sadie, she whispered again. I turned off the wheel and wiped my hands, and I did not run to her, and I did not run from her either. I just looked at her, this woman who had gotten older and smaller than the mother in my memory, and I waited, because I had learned at the fire that you do not rush the thing that is trying to happen. I did not know it was you, she said, holding the bowl up like evidence. This has been in my kitchen for 3 years. I have held it every morning. She was crying now. I have been holding your work in my hands every single day, and I did not know. The old me, the 18-year-old who ran, would have used that. Would have laid out everything I had built, every gallery, every child I had taught, and watched it land like a blow. I felt her rise in me, ready to win the old argument at last. But I was standing in common clay, surrounded by the work of kids nobody bet on, and I did not want to win an argument. I wanted the truth, which is a different and harder thing. You did not know, I said, because you were not there for any of it, Mom. You judged me by how I looked going in. That is the whole story, right there. You had a daughter you decided was gray and practical, and not worth the investment, and you were so sure of it you never stayed to see what the fire made of her. She sank onto the stool by the door, still clutching the bowl. And then she told me what I had not known. That Miles's big idea had failed, of course, and the one after it, and the one after that, until the family money my father had spent his life building was simply gone. That my father had had a heart attack 2 years ago and come out of it a quieter, humbler man. That they had spent years half looking for me, and then stopped, telling themselves I would come home when I was ready, because that was easier than admitting they had driven me out. And that the bowl, my bowl, bought by chance from a shop downtown, had somehow become the thing she held on the worst mornings, never knowing whose hands had made it. The daughter she let go had been quietly holding her up for 3 years, and neither of us had known. Here is why I did not do what the internet would have cheered for. I did not have to destroy anything. Miles had already destroyed it himself. My parents were not sitting at the head of a long table anymore. They were sitting in the wreckage of the exact choice they made that night, and no revenge I could invent would be sharper than that. So I had a decision to make, the same one I always come back to. Do I pour the fire into breaking them, or into making something last? I chose the second, but choosing the second is not the same as pretending the first never happened, and I need to be clear about that too. I let my mother back in, slowly, on my terms. I did not hand her a key to the deepest room in me, the one she had already burned down once, because forgiveness that hands the arsonist a fresh match is not forgiveness, it is just a longer fuse. But I let her sit in my studio. I let her watch me work. I let her meet Kayla and the other kids, and I watched something crack open in her when she saw the girl she had thrown away spending her life catching the kids nobody caught. My father came a month later. He walked into common clay smaller than I remembered, and he stood in front of a wall of my work, and he did not make excuses, which was new. He said, I looked at your acceptance letter for 4 seconds that night. 4 seconds. And I have thought about those 4 seconds every day since my heart stopped. He was crying, this man who never cried. I bet on the wrong child, he said. Not because Miles was wrong, because I never even looked at you long enough to see there was a bet to make. And that was true, and it was terrible, and it was also the first honest thing he had ever given me, so I let him have it, and I let it sit between us without rushing to make it comfortable, because some things have to be felt all the way to the bottom. Miles took the longest, which was right, because Miles had spent his whole life being the son and had just watched his own gravity collapse. He did not come for almost a year. And when he came, he did not come for money, because by then he understood I was not going to be his next investor. He came and stood at the back of the studio and watched me teach, and afterward he said, I do not know how to do anything real. I have spent my whole life pitching things that did not exist. You spent yours making things you can hold. He asked if I would teach him, not fund him, teach him, and it was the first time in 30 years my brother had asked me for something that was not money, so I said yes. Slowly, on level ground. He sweeps the floor now, some weekends, the way I did. He is bad at the wheel and he laughs at himself about it, which is also new, and I am not naive, I am watching, but the door is open a crack, and he is earning the rest of the way through it himself. That is the only kind of forgiveness that does not just teach people they can burn you for free. I forgave my family. I did not hand them back the match. Both of those things are true, and holding them together is the hardest and most honest thing I have ever done, harder than any glaze. I kept that first ugly piece I pulled from Della's kiln, the one whose color made me cry. It sits on the windowsill of my office, next to the $200, which I never spent, framed now, and a small photo of an old woman with a broom. Not to remind me of where I came from. To remind me that you cannot judge the glaze going in. Because that is the thing the fire taught me, the thing that turned out to be about so much more than clay. You never know the true color of a person by how they look going into the fire. The same gray powder that one family throws away, another kiln turns the color of a river at dusk. My family judged me by how I looked going in, a plain, practical, quiet little thing not worth the cost. They were not there for the fire, so they never got to see the color it brought out of me. But I did, and Della did. And now a studio full of thrown-away kids does too, and they are learning to see it in themselves, which is the only inheritance I ever actually wanted. If you are reading this and someone who was supposed to bet on you looked at you for 4 seconds and decided you were not worth the investment, I want to leave you standing at the kiln with your hands still dirty. Do not let the people who left before the fire tell you your color. They do not know it. They cannot. So tell me down below, what is the thing the fire brought out of you that the people who wrote you off will never get to see? Because I promise you the gray powder was never the truth, and the true color was always waiting on the other side of the heat.